Just a reminder, a bit of a plea, these podcasts are not designed to be reviews of the episodes. There are plenty of podders saying how wonderful/deplorable, delete as appropriate, these episodes are, and that Doctor Who has never been better/is dead, delete as appropriate. I'm not doing that. I'm trying to say interesting, hopefully entertaining things based on an element of the latest episode of Doctor Who. Just trying to do something different, and maybe a bit funny. So, whether you think I should love/hate, delete as appropriate, the episode doesn't really matter. And so if such whimsical meanderings are not for you, that's fine. Just delete them as appropriate. Thank you. Welcome to Indefinable Magic. Directionless monologues that ponder on the nature of a lifelong love of something intended to plug a gap in the TV schedule back in 1963. Written and presented by me, Toby Haydoke. In these bite-sized editions, I'll be trying to get to grips with one aspect of the latest episode of Doctor Who to see if I can say something interesting about it. I can't guarantee I'll succeed, but by God I'll have a bash. Tonight's instalment of Indefinable Magic Bite Size, after Empire of Death, written by Russell T. Davies, is called Preparing for the Moment. If you see Sid, tell him. Sorry. Now, as you can tell, it's taken a little extra time to produce this, the last in this series of podcasts inspired by the latest episodes of Doctor Who. It's because I don't like endings. I'm terrible at them. In fact, there are some shows I've religiously followed that I haven't watched the final instalment of. Sharp. Oh, I love it. Mighty Sean Bean, bastarding and chosen menning and Posho being cleverer thaning his way through the Napoleonic Wars with principled northern pragmatism and rough-hewn sex appeal. Fantastic show, right up my street. But I've resisted watching the final part of the series proper, partly because I think a couple of regulars I rather like die in it, and if I don't watch, I think that at least keeps them alive in my headcanon. And I have the final series of Spooks still shrink-wrapped on my shelf, despite having watched the first 6 over and over again. Someone spoiled a major event in it for me, and now I know that my enjoyment of whatever unfolds will be tainted by A, this event, which will make me sad, B, knowledge that the event is coming, so I won't appreciate it as the makers had intended, because, well, I know it's coming, and C, annoyance at the person who spoiled it for me when I had literally told them I hadn't seen the series yet and was waiting to enjoy it. First world problems, I know, but there wouldn't be first world problems if people weren't dicks. And such first world problems are the reason I stay up at midnight to watch Doctor Who, lest someone text me at midnight 55 saying, "I love the bit where they defeated Sutik with a dog lead," or whatever. Actually, I knew the ending moment of This Life, the groundbreaking cool lawyer show with Sheriff Rick from The Walking Dead when he was but an egg, plus Dimmond from Nightmare of Eden and lots of young people being cool and sexy. I was addicted to the reruns of that, but had to be out for the final episode. It famously had an explosive moment, a punch that had been coming for several episodes and was a triumphant bit of closure, and so a much-anticipated and satisfying climax. So I taped it, but then resisted watching it. I suspect I still have the cassette somewhere, but nothing to play it on. I guess I somehow knew the anticipation might be better than the experience, the build-up, more exciting than the payoff. For climaxes, by their very nature, are always followed by some kind of dysphoria. All the things we enjoy that give us pleasure, a satisfying job, a special party, a personal achievement, and, yes, a sexual act, always play themselves out, accompanied by the blues. And look, I haven't even ended this block of broadcasts in a manner consistent with the build-up episodes. I didn't start with a quote from the instalment of Doctor Who that has inspired this edition of the podcast like I normally would. I'm sure if you have a friend called Sid who is a Doctor Who fan, you'll be telling him this when you see him. For the currently baffled, in 1986, British Gas was privatised, and an advertising campaign was devised to encourage the public to buy a share in something they actually currently owned, but were soon about not to. They could, however, buy bits of it back if they wanted. The campaign began with a commercial, the first in a series, in which various characters informed each other of the forthcoming marketing of utilities, and imploring each other that, if you see Sid, tell him. The wheeze certainly caught on, until some months later, with the deadline fast approaching, the last advert of the campaign featured a lone fell climber clambering up a hostile incline and seeing, through the mist, a shadowy figure. "Are you Sid?" he asked, as you do, and the unseen stranger answered in the affirmative. Sid was then told the information that seemingly the entire country wanted him to know, that British Gas shares were available. And finally, for the first and only time, the campaign took a supernatural turn as the wind and mist got a bit echoey and strange, and Sid was there no more. It wouldn't have been more genre-busting if they'd, burst into song. But that wasn't the issue here. It was that after months of investment, of the viewing kind, if not the share portfolio assemblage, the British public's intrigue was rewarded with something ephemeral and, ultimately, unsatisfying. I remember my mum hearing talk of people who'd been on the verge of buying shares who were so annoyed by the advert not giving them what they wanted, an answer to the "who is Sid" question, that they decided not to purchase after all. Campaign failed. Leaving aside the pros and cons of selling off the country's assets and or encouraging competition, delete as appropriate, the campaign itself was a classic case of something that was ultimately scuppered by its own success. Good advertising is notoriously tricky. You need something pithy that will catch on and get people talking so much that it places your product in a lot of people's minds, to the extent that as many of them as possible either purchase it, if it is a product, or watch it, if it is a program. And there was indeed a dramatic equivalent earlier in the decade. Never mind seeing Sid, what about shooting JR? The 1980 season of hit show Dallas ended on a cliffhanger, with the show's villain, whom everyone loved to hate, J.R. Ewing, played by Larry Hagman, being shot by an unseen assailant. This provoked tie-in merchandise. I remember how funny the "Who Shot JR" t-shirts and hats sported by people were. They were affectionately acknowledging the zeitgeist, an example of popular culture uniting us with shared enjoyment of a horrible thing happening in popular fiction. It even became a talking point during the US election, a cultural keystone which could be used to reach voters. When you don't know the answer to a question, people like to speculate, and speculation leads to theories, and people like having and sharing theories, and how amazing does it feel if yours turns out to be correct. As it was, JR was shot by pretty much the only suspect who wasn't a cast member on a regular contract, but it didn't really matter. Now everybody knew what Dallas was, and the next best thing to everyone buying or watching your product is everyone knowing what it is, even, in this case, those in the running for the top job in politics. It's a shame, then, that in our recent 2024 election campaign in the UK, the identity of Ruby Sunday's mum did not make enough of an impact to be invoked by our aspiring prime ministers. "Your policies are so bad they deserve to be left out in the snow by a mysterious hooded woman," would have been a great riposte in one of the prime ministerial debates. "Vote Labour and it'll feel like it's snowing even when you're indoors," or some such. Or that refrain always aimed at the smaller parties who'll never get in. "Oh, it's all right for you to make all these promises. You'll never have to deliver on them. You could promise the moon on a stick, or pledge to give a sensible reason why what turns out to be a teenage girl is dressed as the Lord of the Nazgul and pointing at a road sign in a scary way." Alas, unlike the monster raving loony party, the raving loony monster show, Doctor Who, and indeed any drama, does have to deliver. And this is the tricky thing about story arcs, a relatively new phenomenon in the series' long history. I mean, the show has to go on, and I'd venture to say that Dallas was probably never on anyone's lips as much as it was before we found out who shot JR, and it had to carry on. The classic series of Doctor Who had very few story arcs. The E-Space trilogy was a set of stories bonded by a common theme and a setting, with a beginning, the TARDIS goes into E-Space, and an end, the TARDIS gets out of E-Space. But it wasn't much more complicated than that, and you could still enjoy and understand the stories, well, 2 of them anyway, without the E-Space thing distracting you. And even with the E-Space thing distracting me, I still don't fully understand what Warriors Gate is all about, but I still love it. But that's for another podcast. I suppose the Pertwee Doctor has a semi-arc, doesn't he? A thematic one, which only really becomes apparent at the era's conclusion, where this bristling, acquisitive and slightly vain Doctor is punished for his hubris in a very Buddhist way, by going through a transformative process and becoming a new man. That was Buddhist producer Barry Letts taking an established part of the show's history and using it as a reflection of his own beliefs, a handy storytelling device that got an extra dimension thanks to its potential to be metaphorical. But there weren't loads of indications of this in the build-up. Yes, the theft of the crystal from Metabilis 3 in the Green Death is the beginning of his process towards this metamorphosis of redemption, but there weren't characters in every story reminding him of this. No blood axe staring at him in terror and blabbering, "Beware the crave of crystals, ye knave," or Professor Whittaker sneering, "You've got a spider on your back," or whatever. The only really blatantly conceived season-long arcs in the classic series were the Key to Time season 16, and the Trial of a Time Lord, season 23. The latter, a witty idea to metaphorically reflect the parlour state of the show in the eyes of its bosses at a time when the programme needed fewer witty metaphors and better scripts, is now generally seen as a mistake. Don't force the viewers to commit to 14 weeks of a programme with a tainted reputation, lest they find the idea too daunting and don't tune in, even though the individual stories have been re-evaluated by some in recent years. The Key to Time, though, now that's a biggie. 6 stories making up a series-long quest. But it's basically bookended by a well-known character in a black hat or a white hat facing off with our star and saying stuff. In the case of the latter, it was to start the series with a whacking great bit of exposition in a fancy chair, whilst the latter finally turns up to pretend to be that person, the White Guardian, whilst actually being, a surprise for anyone who'd followed Valentine Dial's career, the Guardian in Black. Yes, each story had the search for the key as part of its plot, some more vitally than others, and indeed the segments were sometimes the answer to the story's main problem. But the actual resolution to the quest was somewhat perfunctory. After 6 months' build-up, having Tom Baker see how far he could test Graham Williams with his silly eye acting before a 3-minute chat with the man in black on a scanner screen does seem a bit perfunctory. But then again, what else were they going to do? It was really just a way of linking the season in an interesting way, but never wanting to dominate the individual stories because that would alienate the casual viewer. So in a way, the journey was always going to be more important than the destination. And as the saying goes, and indeed as Season says in The Sensorites, it's better to travel hopefully than to arrive. And storytelling is sometimes like that. If the posited mystery or quest provokes some fascinating stories and characters along the way, then we can forgive an unsatisfying conclusion, even though, it goes without saying, it would be nice if we could have both. It's no accident that Nigel Kneale's Quatermass in the Pit is considered a classic. It builds up suspense and horror, and it asks various questions, all of which are rationalised and answered within the plausible confines of the story. And the resolution, the way of defeating the ultimate manifestation of evil, makes sense in both realms that the story takes place, the magical and the scientific. However, my favourite era of Doctor Who is probably the Philip Hinchcliffe, Robert Holmes epoch. Robust scripting, muscular dynamics, a wit that is more sardonic than child-friendly. It has well-played horror, intelligent ideas and strong dialogue, not to mention a fabulous dynamic between the leads, fun, intelligent, real, and yet there is always an element of the otherworldly. You'd not imagine them working together in an office, say. They are very much travellers in time and space. For me, and indeed many I know, the Hinchcliffe era is a series of bangers. The majority of the stories, classics, and even those that don't quite work, are solid productions, unhampered by too many shoddy effects or stiff performances. And yet, Hinchcliffe and Holmes' final episodes are awash with unsatisfying conclusions. Even the much-lauded Pyramids of Mars, much lauded by me, I bloody love it and everyone in it, and thoroughly enjoyed revisiting it in the hours before the midnight showing of Empire of Death, has a terrible ending. Sauntering through corridors and solving puzzles, and even replaying scenes from Death to the Daleks, to the extent that they point this out. And Sutek's ultimate defeat in the story is not remotely signposted in the previous episodes, and is based on some pretty unconvincing science. So having him turn out to have survived it, as we discover in Empire of Death, is hardly desecrating a sacred moment. It's not Davros opening his eyes. I doubt that Pyramids of Mars's many fans, and I'm amongst them, think that the ending is the best thing about it. And to be honest, Pyramids of Mars is not alone in the Hinchcliffe oeuvre in this regard. The Seeds of Doom, another favourite of mine, has the RAF called in whilst the Doctor tries to escape from a house. The android invasion hinges upon Milton Johns not having washed his face for the past year or so, and everyone, including the Kral fleet, forgetting about the Kral fleet. Oh, and the Brain of Morbius has the Doctor defeat the monster because there's a Time Lord equivalent of a board game lying around in the corner of the place that they're stuck. The never up to that point mentioned mind-bending competition did, of course, then raise its own kind of question due to the production team deciding to have some fun with the Doctor's faces, a question that fans wrestled with in pub chat over the years, that found itself being a question that this viewer, and I think some others, didn't particularly want answering in a series DNA-altering season finale 40-odd years later, but that's for another podcast. Or maybe not. And I have to say, I think I am, if I'm honest, more of a journey than an arrival man. I was shocked when a friend told me that he hated Earthshock, say, because he said the script was poor, the plot convoluted and nonsensical. And when you think about it, I suppose it probably is. But it's done with such conviction that it made such an impact on me as a kid, and frankly, I still think it holds up, and it looks really good, and it moves at a pace, and so, convoluted plot, I don't care. The plot of my favourite film, 12 Angry Men, is pretty clear from early on, and fairly unlikely, but it's not really there for that. It's about character and justice and prejudice and masculinity and peer group pressure. It's about standing up against the mob, with the jury room as a metaphor for that, although paradoxically the characters are all extremely well drawn, despite representing various types. And of course, it's not real, but good dramas can still be truthful without being real. But whilst I'm fine with things not being real if they facilitate the dramatic or the moving, if I'm a willing participant in allowing the fiction to play out on its own terms, that doesn't mean I forgive bad endings. The Demons is, famously the Pertwee story that everyone loves, but it's always been sort of mentioned, even in the biggest appreciations, that, the ending's a bit of a shame. I love the action-adventure of The Parting of the Ways, but I have a huge problems with just staring into the heart of the TARDIS, suddenly solving everything, as I had 2 weeks earlier in Boomtown. It came from nowhere, and I don't quite know how it works. So whilst I adore the episode, its resolution gives me the vapours. And yes, I can trade one for the other, but for perfection, I need both. And yet Bad Wolf, that season run in question, the first series arc of the programme ever, really, I like that, even though it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't need to. It's a thing, a MacGuffin, a fairy tale phrase that we know means something, and it turns out to mean something. And maybe the issue with this season's arc is that the fairy tale ending given to the mystery of little Ruby's Riding Hood mum turned out to not really mean anything. The big bad wolf turned out to be a nice, sweet grandmother after all. Well, a nice, sweet, unmarried young teen mother. Now, It's a witty subversion of the idea that something is really important, and that everyone has to come from something or someone special in order to be a Doctor Who companion. And arguably, the series needed to restate that companions are just ordinary people and not mysteries to be solved. That's how we can identify them. Yes, perfect, bravo. But the only reason we thought Ruby was a mystery is because we'd been told that she was by the series. Funny enough, this podcast is its own kind of season finale. I hadn't intended these to be linked. In fact, I'd barely hoped for coherence, as I wanted to get them out quickly, for them to be scattergun thoughts with a loose connection inspired by each new episode. But actually, and this often happens when writing, some opportunities present themselves to tie these bite-sized releases together as I come to a climax. I hope I don't leave you disappointed. When I talked about Space Babies, I looked at how change was part of Doctor Who, and how things that might have been unconscionable to one generation of viewers is taken in the stride of the next, and how some things we expected might destroy the show for us actually don't. This tied in with my thoughts on Rogue, where I was, genuinely, a bit sad about the show deciding that it needed to nail the Doctor down as a sexual being, one for whom a romantic connection subsumed all his other concerns in the episode of the week. Well, come the end of the season, we have seen exactly what changes have been made to the show and what haven't. There was conjecture that perhaps the more fantastical element of some of the stories and threats were as a result of the Toymaker fracturing the sides of reality and allowing for foes of a more far-fetched, even fourth-wall-breaking fashion. This gave us the musical finale to The Devil's Chord, with a bizarrely anachronistic presence of Murray Gold, Shirley Ballas and Johannes Radebe as themselves, even though they would have looked considerably different in 1962, what with only Dame Shirley being born by then, and at 2 years old, probably not quite so nimble. Was this season going to conclude with the fourth ball being totally broken? Was the answer to all this that the world was a fictional one, that somehow the Toymaker had made the show meta, and that this was all some weird postmodern universe? That would have been fascinating, tricky, divisive, but ultimately fresh and experimental and daring. Turns out, nope. Stylistically and format-wise, the show is pretty much as it always has been, except that Angie from EastEnders sometimes says something enigmatic to the camera, which Russell T Davies now says may never be explained, but he could well be lying because, well, he's a storyteller, and he's allowed to tell fibs in order to misdirect and tantalise the audience, you silly sods. I have noticed, though, and I can't avoid this as much as I like to accentuate the positives in my Who broadcasting, that my subject for the Boom episode, faith, is one that Doctor Who has struggled to retain in some quarters this year. Now, it may be that I've spent too much time in internet rabbit holes, I know I do, dotting my own bubble, if you like. Tuning in for reactions, I may well be drawn to the more apocalyptically presented. I'm a natural pessimist, but that's because I think if I have low expectations, everything is always a pleasant surprise. And yet even the pessimist me was quite shocked when the viewing figures came in. Yes, I know iPlayer, yes, I know streaming, etc., but still, and I'm no expert, and this is not a podcast for number crunching, I thought it would have done better. And of course, unlike some, I want Doctor Who to do well. I like Doctor Who, old and new. I like Russell T Davies's Doctor Who. But I hope this series would do better in the public eye than to me it seems to have done. Anecdotally, at least. I hope to be proved wrong. And, of course, the beauty of faith, of religion, and the show is the closest thing I have to either of those, though I have the advantage of knowing that it's all made up, and so I can't use this as an excuse for evil-doing. Not that that's the case with all Doctor Who fans these days, but hey-ho, is that you can chalk any tricky situation up to a test of one's faith, and an incentive to hold one's nerve. Hopefully, my prayers will be answered. General public aside, there seems to be a lot of fan talk about this finale, and this is where, interestingly, I'll probably contradict a lot of what I said in the podcasts about both 73 Yards, in which I discussed, amongst my musings on the horrific, the nature of its unspecific ending, notably Ruby's whispered announcement that made everyone clear off, and The Legend of Ruby Sunday, in which I got very excited about a returning actor playing the same part he essayed in 1975. But that's fine, because much as some feedbackers seem baffled that I might entertain an idea without necessarily being definitively wedded to it or using it as a value judgment, I find cognitive dissonance pretty easy. I'm a Doctor Who fan, for God's sake. I can acknowledge that in one episode it was of total importance that he's half-human, and also acknowledge that that's a load of old sub-Spockian bollocks I choose to ignore. I can acknowledge that, say, Resurrection of the Daleks has massive problems with logic, script, and in some areas realisation, and yet absolutely adore watching it and not care about any of its apparent shortcomings when I fire it up as my go-to piece of Sunday afternoon escapism. I did kind of get over the unspecific nature of Phantom Ruby's safe word in 73 Yards, but part of me did harbour the suspicion that maybe it would get explained in the finale, especially as the 73 Yards measurement popped up to lure us into thinking that every now and again. And what about the Doctor's granddaughter, Susan? Invoked, dangled, mused upon? Will she be Ruby's mother? Is she Susan Triad? Is that the Susan twist? Well, talk about nominative determinism. I like that idea. I mean, Gabriel Wolfe turned out to be playing a big bad dog, so why not have Susan Twist being the Susan Twist? I think there should be more of that sort of thing. The cricket-loving Fifth Doctor often found himself confounded, after all, by an Australian, by Janet Fielding. But I don't know. I think it took a lot of chutzpah to say, you know that mystery we postulated? It wasn't actually a mystery at all. What made you think Ruby's mother was special in the first place? Well, you did, Doctor Who. It'd be a bit like Twin Peaks having the big reveal of, no, Laura Palmer just died of natural causes. Actually, she's not even dead. What made you think that? Who shot JR? Don't you mean who bought JR a lovely dinner and just had a lovely chat about oil with him? If you see Sid, tell him, there is no Sid. And the Susan talk, that got the pre-credits, for goodness sake, also amounted to nothing. Now, I don't mind that, because much as I praised the return of the Wolf Man last time, I do have my other eye, the self-loathing one, on how little all of that stuff will mean to the new fans the show is supposed to be after. I have a weird schizophrenia about old references. I love them for me, but they terrify me because I fear that they are for me and I'm not important. I worry about holding a new party in a fancy big Mickey Mouse castle and then showing all the new guests my holiday snaps from 40 years ago that only 3 other people at the shindig have any interest in at all. Obviously, the TV landscape is new, and we have hitherto been very spoilt with Doctor Who and its success. Its overnight success, despite what you may have read elsewhere, and that there are murmurings that this season hasn't quite lived up to expectations. Or, as the internet puts it, it's a disaster and everyone involved should be killed. The truth is probably somewhere in between, except for the killing bit. No killing, not even halfway killing. TV itself is going through a state of flux, but I have noticed that Mr. Bates versus the Post Office managed to do extremely well despite all of this. Shows that are grabbing a wide audience are becoming appointment viewing. Maybe the draw of Mr. Bates is a sign of the times, though. Social media is dominated by real content and people trying to settle scores and address injustice. So maybe a drama, as Mr. Bates was, about real life that actually prompted legislative action, the ultimate score settling, is what people have more of an appetite for right now. Yeah, that's definitely a sign of the times, and I'm sure the pendulum will swing again. People don't go without fantasy for long. In the meantime, I look forward to next year's Who season finale, where he unmasks the villains hidden cunningly in plain sight as Paul Ostoffice, Colin Apitalism, or Peter Oxic Masculinity. Stranger things have happened. But, as I say, that may be because these days we seek our answers online, in the opinions of others, and that's how we get our validation too. And as a child of the cancellation, growing up in the wake of the hiatus and the subsequent disappearance of the show, I've always worried about the current state of Doctor Who, and I've always found myself unsatisfied by endings. I expected Tom Baker's, my Doctor, the longest incumbent of the role, finale to be all explosions and fighting and battles and things, not death because of lots of dusty abacuses caused by maths in a lay-by. I loved the parting of the ways, but I didn't like the kiss much, see, never liked the kissing, nor the resolution. And I remember being very cross when Journey's End rewrote an ending that I had liked, that of Doomsday, by revisiting the perfection of Bad Wolf Bay and leaving Rose now with, essentially, an organic dildo. Subverting that heart-wrenching Doctor and Rose parting from Doomsday for one that could, now, if needed, provide David Tennant and Billie Piper with a film franchise should they ever need one. Though now we also have another David Tennant Doctor twiddling his thumbs in Chiswick. Is there anyone in Rome who hasn't got a spare David Tennant incarnation lying around? And this latest one came about to rewrite another tragic ending, one of the show's best, Donna's memory loss, and to turn it into a happy one. When series you see are infinite, when they don't have an actual fixed end point, you can revisit story threads and characters at any time. And of course, if you have a character and an actor that you like, the temptation must be huge to get the band back together. That's the joy and the difficulty of a long-running series like Doctor Who. We like returning to old characters, and so even if they get the best ending ever, there's always the option to bring them back, and so that ending ceases to be an ending. In fact, I never watched the episodes of Only Fools and Horses that came after those brilliant final episodes where they walked into the sunset, having finally become millionaires. Because it was so perfect. But to follow perfection, you have to undo it in order for drama to happen. No one's going to watch a comedy about everything being hunky-dory. No one's going to watch a sci-fi show which revisits an event but doesn't change it. I was hooked for a while to The X-Files, which had a mystery to solve. What happened to Mulder's sister? A personal backdrop to several other questions about government conspiracies and aliens, and a bevy of supporting characters whose returns were always rather exciting and sometimes revealed in a pre-title sting. Some of these characters were even killed off in shock moments in season finales. But of course, then they'd come back. Returning villain, the cigarette-smoking man, seemed to be on a mission to prove that rather than seriously damaging your health, cigarettes did, in fact, make you invincible. But each time, each shock death turned out not to be a death, the effectiveness of said deaths was diminished. And Mulder's sister, turns out she wasn't abducted by aliens at all, but actually fairies from the bottom of the garden that had nothing to do with the major conspiracy of the series. I kid you not. I think that's right anyway. I did kind of lose interest. So, all of that makes some of the twists in Empire of Death, or Shooty and the Dog Thing, seem positively straightforward. Success means that things can never be truly wrapped up. And what that means, of course, is that my current understanding of the mystery of Ruby Sunday is probably not what will be our ultimate one, because the canon will change. It will metamorphose. We already know that Millie Gibson is back next year, and we can be pretty sure Mrs. Flood has some questions to answer. In the nominative determinism pantheon, the clever money is on her being the shape-shifting robot disappointment chameleon, who, lest we forget, was originally played by actor Gerald Flood. Or we're looking in the wrong direction, and is she just an old ally of the Doctor who is poisoning the Sunday family via their garden? Neighbour Flood is, after all, an anagram of herb fouling ood. Well, you know, if this hiding behind sort of anagrams thing catches on. But think about it. The parting of the ways wasn't the end of Bad Wolf. It resurfaced in the fabulous Sucker Punch that was the conclusion of Turn Left, and Rose had already been making her presence felt, after her very final "we'll never see the Doctor again" appearance in the following season's finale, Doomsday. Harold Saxon, the running arc of Series 3, was dead and buried, even burned, come the conclusion of The Last of the Time Lords, but it was the last of nothing of the sort. I mean, hey, even the wonderful endings given to Joe Grant and Sarah Jane Smith in the classic series turned out to have coders waiting in the wings decades later. If you hang around long enough and are a popular enough character or actor, then no amount of preparation can mean that your ending definitely is one. So I know I'm always a little deflated come the season's end, and yet I always go back to these bells and whistles episodes and love them in retrospect. I love an RTD finale, I really do, even though if I think about it, when I first watched each of them, I was immediately on the phone, bitching to my mates about what I didn't like about them. Because that's part of how I enjoy Doctor Who too. The catharsis of fuming about our pastime is all a bit of a part of it. I love this show. Here are a million things that are wrong with it. And as we know, Empire of Death might not actually be the end of any of the stories that we saw in it, because the show can revisit moments at any time. So the very concept of a finale in this programme is flawed. Nothing is ever over. No story completed or rounded off, because a return visit or a character reunion is always possible. We can't be unsatisfied because, frankly, no matter how well prepared for, nothing is truly the end, because Doctor Who goes on. And even when it was cancelled, when it looked like it was all over, it was far from being so, because it came back. So even though Ben Aronovich said in the documentary 30 Years in the TARDIS, which was itself revisited and changed when released on physical media, it's always happening, that he'd end the show by killing the Doctor, well, I don't think you can. You can't end the show, even if it gets wrested, cancelled, or even blown into a tiny million pieces. History tells us that one day it might come back. Yes, one day. So there's a big reason that Doctor Who endings are strange beasts. It's the knowledge that they might not well be the endings they seem to be. Because, frankly, Doctor Who, the series, the show, the phenomenon, should, and I think we can confidently now say, the programme itself, even though there'll be breaks, there'll be portents of doom, there'll be hiatuses, but Doctor Who will never, ever end. No tears, Sarah Jane, because while there's life, there's hope. But that doesn't stop us getting furious, does it? But, as I say, that is what being a fan is. So, for now, I'm going to try not to be a Harriet of Doom. I'm going to try to accept the changes, to enjoy the tune, know the score, to keep the faith, to provide my own answers to the unanswered questions, to go beyond my social media bubble, to ignore the bits I don't like, and not feel guilty about the references to the old episodes because I like them really, and it's not for me to worry about those who don't get them, who'll surely be fine. Oh, look, that paragraph I just said, that tied everything into a neat ending. That had an aspect of every single podcast I've done leading up to this in it. Now, I hadn't planned it like this when I started writing it, but look, I managed to stick the landing. After 8 weeks of random thoughts, some jokes, a few ideas, some contradictions and experiments and last-minute expedients, I've managed to wrap it up. Ha! See? It's not that hard. I pulled off a neat, tidy ending without any Ah! Thank you for listening to Indefinable Magic. Tonight's episode, Preparing for the Moment After Empire of Death, was written and presented by me, Toby Haydock. The podcast artwork is by Dylan Patterson, and the music was specially composed by Dominic Glynn. I'd like to thank the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Ruben Herfindahl, Peter Burns, James Curray-Smith, Peter Harness, Ronald Hayden, Rob Leonard, Christopher Meredith, Gavin McLean, Richard Straw, Neil Tate, Nick Tedston, Paul Kirkley, Richard Riley, Matthew Tate, Alan W. Wright, Matt Foy, Susie Ferguson, Neil Humphreys, Rebecca Burgess, David Gates, Mark Wright, Darcy Smart, Paul Lindblad, El Pandras, Tim Arding, Nigel Bromley, Paul Cook, Richard Chalk, Peter Chamberlain, Grant Davidson, John Deere, Chris Dunford-Kelk, Paul Dunn, and Jason Gorman. If you would like your name read out on the podcast, well, that is one of the bonuses of being a patron. You can become a patron at patreon.com/Toby Haydock, where for as little as £3 a month you get advance releases, behind-the-scenes materials, and some exclusive content as well, monthly AMAs, and little photos and videos from the making-ofs of the various Doctor Who Blu-rays and DVDs and other things that I work on. If you don't want to do that monthly thing, you can do a one-off contribution at ko-fi.com/Toby Haydock. But a way of supporting these non-financially, which is absolutely fine, I'm just grateful to you for listening, is to go to Patreon, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, everywhere, particularly Apple and iTunes, that these podcasts are available, and give them a 5-star score and a few lines of review to say what you like about them. That really helps to tart up the algorithms and get them out there so that more people can see and hear them. Thank you. I appreciate it if you've already done that, and if you're about to, I'm really grateful. I'm on all the social medias. I'm on Twitter, if you want to call it X, please do, while you're inside your spaceship on a journey to Cathay. At Haydock Podcasts is the Twitter feed dedicated entirely to these. But I also have at Toby Haydock, which is not just about the podcasts, but about the various other Doctor Who things I do, as well as acting and writing and comedy and the various other ways I make a living. I'm on Instagram at toby.haydock. I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page which has all my stuff posted on it. And I also have a YouTube channel, Toby Haydock, where these podcasts are now available. I mean, they're not videos, they just have a placeholder, but it's another way of consuming them. So any thumbs up and scores and traffic towards those, because they've only just started to go up, would be very helpful. And if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, like and subscribe me in every single area of the internet, and it just makes me feel like I'm alive. Yeah, it took ages, that one, isn't it? It's because the previous 7 I had to get out before the next episode was broadcast. I thought, well, I'll spend a bit more time on this one, but polishing it. But it's still pretty much what I wrote, in the shadow of the episode. I just kept thinking, oh God, I don't want to go back to that one now. It was a bit like the whole, oh yeah, I don't want to watch the ending to that now. I didn't want to do the ending. It's a weird thing about closure. So it was still a bit, reading that back, it's still a bit, I think, unfocused and a bit all over the place, but I hope it raises, all it's there to do is raise a few thoughts. Hopefully this is a bit like a sort of pub chat where you don't get to say anything. So I would never claim any of these are definitive thoughts, even though I do try and structure them and have callbacks and things. They're not intended to be definitive, which a lot of people haven't quite picked up by going, well, actually, I just thought the episode was shit. And it's like, that's not really the point. But anyway, you can only do what you do. And this is what I've done, and I hope you like it. And I've already written another Indefinable Magic on a totally different subject, so that's at least kick-started me getting back into doing these because I'd not done some for a while. So yes, perhaps not preparing for an end, but for a new beginning. But anyway, it's been a useful way of digesting Doctor Who, of not just watching it for pleasure, but watching it with with producing something afterwards. And hopefully, as I say, something temperate and thoughtful, because there's lots of people squeeing, and there's lots of people, whatever the opposite of squeeing is, getting very cross. My goodness, getting very cross. And as I say, an attempt to do something different. I've said that so many times now. You're probably bored of it. So to see off any boredom, let's do what we've been preparing for and end.